Welcome back. I am Jan Nimick, Angler Education for the Nevada Department of Wildlife, and we are here for our Trout in the Classroom virtual program 2021. Welcome again. We have so far had our introduction session, and then last week we had a great lesson on habitat and life cycle. And today we are going to take a look at fishing. So our basic fishing methods, as well as the equipment that goes with those methods. So we'll just get right to it here. Okay, once again, welcome. We're back for the virtual Trout in the Classroom. Again, this is session 3, Introduction to Fishing, an easy way to put it. We still have lots ahead of us. So for today, a quick update on the eggs. Our trout eggs have arrived. There is a live TU as well as temperature on that live stream. I have emailed that back out to everybody. So if you don't have it or need it, or for any reason need some help with that, please reach out to one of us. I believe there are about 428 TUs, so they're getting there. They're definitely right. We should see them start to hatch on the live stream soon. Our in-class eggs have tails at this point, so they're again a little bit ahead of the live stream eggs, but so far so good. Okay, today is exciting for me because I am again Jan, Angler Education, Nevada Department of Wildlife. So it's my job to teach people about fish and fishing. So today is all about that. In addition to kind of taking a look in at fishing, just kind of the basic methods there. When we wrap up the slideshow, we're actually going to tie a basic fishing knot in addition to taking a look at some of the 3 methods or the 3 pieces of equipment that we're going to go over today. So to start, what is fishing? Fishing is the activity of catching fish either for food or as sport. So easy definition, at going after fish. Now, you can fish with your hands, you can fish with a net, you can fish with a pole or a rod, you can fish with a cage, you can fish with a spear, you can fish with a bow and arrow. I'll stop there. You can fish with a lot of different things. What we're looking at today is everything that is defined with the word angler. So an angler is somebody that uses a fishing pole or fishing rod and reel to catch fish. And that's specifically what we're looking at today. Okay, so on this, it says either catching fish for food or sport. And that can be a little confusing because there's definitely 2 different sides to fishing. For food, you can look at going out and fishing an urban pond for dinner. Some of the families, it's a great pastime locally. It is a great way to get outside and keep it easy. So there's that. We have commercial fishermen, which fish or commercially fish to sell the fish. So that would be another form of fish for food. And then the last category, or the last one there, sport. Sport is not for food, so for fun. So we've got fishing for food and fishing for fun. With that in mind, a lot of folks that fish for fun do and do not keep their fish. So everybody, for the most part, that's fishing for food is keeping their fish. And then fishing for sport, a lot of people practice what's called catch and release. And that is the act of catching the fish and letting it go, reviving it sometimes, making sure that it swims off safe and sound. So it is a great way to keep fish populations up that don't get help from our hatchery. So we're going to go a little bit more into that later down the road. But here we go into some methods here. All right, so I would call the 3 basic methods bait fishing, spin fishing, and fly fishing. And the first one we'll talk about here, bait fishing, is certainly the easiest. It It doesn't have the least amount of pieces, so as far as equipment goes, it's certainly not the easiest. However, to actually do it, it's definitely the easiest method to fish. Bait fishing requires using a hook, putting on some sort of bait, whether it's a worm, a salmon egg, power bait, marshmallow, cheese, all kinds of different forms there, and casting it out to the fish and letting it sit for them to eat it. And then when they eat it, you reel them in. To do that, we use a few different things. These are kind of the essential supplies that you would need to go bait fishing. So first and foremost, we've got hooks there. There's a few different types and styles depending on the size of the fish you're fishing for. Down below it, we have two pieces that kind of decide for us where we're fishing. We have bobbers, which float on the surface, and then we have weights, which take our bait down to the bottom. So a bobber is going to ride or float on the surface and kind of indicate to us when a fish eats our bait under that bobber. Weights do exactly that. They take our bait down to the bottom, and we actually feel the fish on our fishing pole when a fish eats the bait off the bottom. Swivels there are just kind of another piece that you need to build these outfits or build these rigs, we would call them. And the two different types of bait, the easiest to use really, we have salmon eggs, which sink. So we would fish our salmon eggs under a bobber. And then we have our power bait, which floats, which we would fish on the bottom. So with our weights on the bottom, we would fish a floating bait to keep it up off the bottom a little bit, to keep it from getting lost in the bottom. So it's kind of a good look at everything that you would need to go bait fishing. Next up is spin fishing. Spin fishing is kind of one step up from bait fishing. With the bait, you are casting out and waiting. So you're waiting for the fish to eat it. As you start to fish more and more, sometimes bait fishing can get old. It get old watching a bobber for long periods of time. So spin fishing is kind of the next step up as far as activity level. Spin fishing, because you're constantly casting, you're not casting and letting the bait sit out. With spin fishing, you're actually casting what's called a spinner. Those guys right there, casting that out with your fishing pole and then bringing it back in. So there's kind of constant activity, whereas the bait, again, you're just sitting and watching. So our spinners, we can walk along the bank, cast, retrieve it, cast, retrieve it, cast, retrieve it. We're kind of always moving, so kind of always occupying us. Great next step onto bait fishing. One thing you want to keep in mind with the spinners is they have a tendency to sink. So if you kind of look, we're going to go back one slide. If you look at the water there underneath the pier that these guys are fishing on, these kids are fishing on, you can see a lot of vegetation growing. So you can see the weeds growing in the water there. With a spinner, that is likely going to get tangled up in that, at least real close to the shore there where there's a lot of weeds. So when you are fishing spinners, you want to make sure you're in open water, or if there's a lot of weeds down near the bottom, you're retrieving it quickly so it doesn't allow it to sink. Because that spinner made of metal, so it's definitely going to want to sink. Again, there's our spinners. Those are the two most popular. You probably have heard of them, a rooster tail, and then also a panther martin. Okay, the first two methods that we talked about, bait fishing and spin fishing, can be done with two different types of rods. I'm going to show you those here at the end after we tie our basic fishing knot. But those two rods that bait fishing and spin fishing can be performed, or you can do with them, is a button reel or a closed bail reel and a spin reel. So we have a button reel and a spin reel that you can use to fish either bait or spinners. This next method, fly fishing, our third method, is not quite that easy as far as the equipment goes. It's a little more involved with the equipment. However, it's still pretty easy to do, and it does require a different type of rod and reel than our bait and spin fishing. let's look at fly fishing, why it's called fly fishing. The fly is exactly that, not like a house fly, but actually a semi-aquatic insect that we can find in most of our rivers and lakes. This example here in front of us is a mayfly. On the far left of your screen, you can see that there is a nymph, and that nymph lives underwater like that for about a year. And that's found again in rivers and lakes with all of our fish. So the fish that we're fishing for are eating those. That is primary diet of our smaller fish. So that nymph, we actually have a fly that imitates that. Next to that is the emergence. And what the emergence is kind of like a caterpillar, not exactly like, but kind of like a caterpillar. It goes from inside the cocoon or from caterpillar to butterfly. Some of our aquatic insects do that. This one does not, but it does change, and it goes from that nymph stage or the underwater insect to our winged insect, or our insect that flies around. That stage that's in between those two is called emergence. And those insects that are going from the bottom or underwater to the top and flying away are vulnerable to our trout. So fly fishermen really use that stage of the insect's life to catch fish. It's probably the most exciting part of the insect's life to imitate as a fly fisherman, because the fish are most active, most aggressive. They have a tendency to just go bonkers for those emerging nymphs. So when they've emerged, they've popped out of their little shell. If you see those two in that emergence box, there's one there's still a bug inside, and then the one on the right actually is just an empty shell, and that's that bug that you see next to it. At the adult has popped out, dried its wings, and flown away. So we have our adult insect, which is this guy here. We also imitate that as fly fishermen. Those, once they come out of their little shell, those actually will remain on the surface for long periods of time, and fly fishermen imitate those flies on the surface. That last stage there, the spinner, is actually kind of the end of the life cycle. So that's the dead insect back on the water after it's laid its eggs in the water, and they've sunk to the bottom, and we've go right back into that life cycle again. And every stage of that life is imitated with flies. So we have flies that imitate the nymph underwater, the emerging insect, which is kind of underwater and above water. We have our adult insect, which we imitate with a dry fly or floating fly. And then lastly, our spinner, we also imitate with our dry or our floating fly. That gives you an idea of why fly fishing is called fly fishing. That's the fly in the fishing. And here's just an example here of some of those insects, or actually one of the insects that we imitate. In northern Nevada, this is a very popular insect on the Carson, East Walker, as well as Truckee rivers, the caddisfly. On the far left there, you see caddisfly nymph, and it's a little hard to tell, but it is a pretty green insect. I have bad lighting in the photograph I took there, but just the kind of the general shape, size, looking at it, this is the nymph imitation, or that wet fly imitation next to it. So it's a pretty close imitation, if you ask me. Great fly for imitating that caddisfly nymph. Now next to it, kind of on this blade of grass, is our caddisfly adult. So after it's come out of that nymph stage or popped out of its shell, we have our adult caddisfly. And next to that is our fly that imitates exactly that, our adult caddisfly imitation. So these two stages are probably the most popular to imitate with the caddis, and just to give you an example of the flies that are imitating the actual insect. To go fly fishing, you really don't need a lot of stuff besides the rod. Once you have the rod, the reel, the line, you kind of have that side of it. Really, the only thing you need to actually go fly fishing is a leader and a fly. We're going to take a look at that fly fishing pole here in a minute. So you'll get a little bit understanding what the leader does, but essentially what the leader does is our fly line isn't like traditional fishing line, where it's clear and very, very skinny or very, very fine diameter. Our fly line is actually very, very heavy, and we need something to connect that very, very heavy line to our fly, because no smart fish on the planet is going to eat a fly tied directly to our fly line. We need some sort of thin fine diameter like fishing line, which is exactly what that is, to connect our fishing or our fly line to our fly. Okay, flies. Now, I know it can be a little confusing, so I just kind of want to reiterate this. We have two different types of flies. We have floating flies, which are called dry flies, which most people know and understand as fly fishing with dry flies. However, fish feed more than 90% under the surface. So it would make sense as a fisherman, especially for me, most likely going out for sport, I want to catch more fish and bigger fish. I want to know where they're eating and why they're eating. So if they're eating 90% under the water, it makes more sense to fish a sinking or a wet fly because that's where they're at. Fish are smart, but fish also have a tendency to tell you where they're eating or where they're feeding. Fish are always eating. Somebody once told me it's kind of like you eating a grain of rice and having to constantly eat that grain of rice, constantly eat. It's the same thing with our smaller fish. They're eating insects that are they're minuscule. They're very, very small. So for them to stay alive, to keep their metabolism, they have to continue to eat. And they're always eating. So if you're not seeing them on the surface, you can see those boils or when they come up to the surface and break the surface, then you know that they're eating stuff under the surface. So it's better to fish something sinking. Okay, finally, some essentials here. And I didn't want to leave this out. There is one item that isn't absolutely essential, but it should be, and it's a pair of sunglasses. So I'll start with that one, eye protection. Hooks have a tendency to get squirrely sometimes. So having some eye protection is definitely great. Some of our other kind of bells and whistles are stuff that we use while we fish. I've got a pair of pliers there. That's great for taking hooks out of fish, smashing barbs. There's a little cutter in that pair of pliers, so you can cut your fishing line. Next to that, I have a stringer. So if you're keeping your fish, it's nice to keep them fresh. So we've got a stringer there that we would use to hold on to the fish and keep them wet or keep them from getting old before we eat them, or clean them and freeze them, depending on what you're doing. Next to that, we have a little pair of, it almost looks like fingernail clippers. And that's actually exactly what that is. Not to cut your fingers, but to fingernails, but to cut the fishing line. So after we've tied a knot, we'll use that to trim the extra line that's there. And then finally, they are no longer paper, but this one's fun to have. This is actually from my grandfather. Fishing license. So you definitely want to make sure if you are required by law to have a fishing license, you want to make sure that you have that. In addition to that, we've got a tackle box and net kind of in the bottom of the picture there, and that just kind of makes things easier, but isn't absolutely essential. So certainly want to thank everybody for listening to that. With the snowstorm that we had last night, I don't think we have anybody on at this point. So if you are listening to this, it's likely pre-recorded, and grateful for you being here. So as promised, I am going to show a few more things. We'll start with all right, there we go. Okay. So I have fishing hook and some fishing line. Not quite, but close. It's going to make it much, much easier to kind of see what I'm doing here. So got my fishing line, and I want to point out right off the bat that our loose end or our short end is always called the tag. So this tag end is going to go through our eye of our hook. Doesn't matter if it's going in that way or if we take it and put it in from the top. Either way. All right, so we've got it through our eye. The next thing I want to point out, we've got our tag. I want to make sure our tag is long. So when you're tying knots, you always want to make sure you have plenty of room to work with. this case, I'm going to pull lots of tag through before I get started. So tag is through the eye. You see that? Nothing fancy. Now I'm going to take my tag end or my short end, and I'm going to wrap that around my main line. So our main line is the line that's connected to our fishing pole. From there, I'm going to wrap the tag around that main line 5 times. And I'm left with what looks like a twisted hook. From there, I'm going to take my short end, and I've got this little loop right next to the eye of the hook. I'm going to put that, my tag, through that little loop. Easy enough. Now from there, I've created this loop after I went through that first loop, and I'm going to pull my line back through that. So I'll do it one more time, a little bit quicker. Before I do that, I'm going to set the knot or seat the knot. And kind of gross, but you want to do before you set this is you want to get it wet. So a lot of people will dunk it in the water. Some people will slobber on it to get it wet. But the idea is you want to create less friction in the fishing line when you're seating or setting that knot. So we would do that. And then we're just going to pull on our main line and watch that come down into what's called kind of like a beehive. And you know you've done this knot properly when it looks like a little beehive. So one more time, a little bit faster. I'm going to tie that knot. So through the eye, plenty of space or plenty of room to work with. So my tag's nice and long. Now this time I'm going to show you one more thing. Instead of spinning my tag around my main line, I'm just going to spin my hook. And there's my 5 turns. So we would then take our tag, put that through, and then pull it back through. And again, to seat it, get it wet, drop it in the water, and pull down. And again, we're looking for that beehive. All right, so that is what's called a improved clinch knot or a basic fishing knot. All right, so finally, we looked at the 3 methods. We looked at bait fishing, spin fishing, and fly fishing. As I kind of pointed out, you can do either the bait fishing or the spin fishing with 2 different types of rods. Those rods, it's going to be a little hard to see the whole rod, but we're going to take a look at the reels here. So I have spinning reel, and then I have a closed bail or a button reel. First up is the button reel. Super easy to use. There's not a lot of moving parts on it, so especially for smaller kids, it's great to get started because there's not a lot of places you can make knots. So with the whole unit closed, line comes out of the top there. To let line out, I press down on that button and let go. So when I let go, that's what actually releases the line off the reel. To reel it in, I just start reeling, and that's it. To cast this, essentially I'm going to press on the button, swing the rod, and just like you throw a baseball, you're going to release that button like you would throw a baseball. Pretty easy. All right, next we have our spinning reel. A little bit more moving parts. You can see there's a lot more to it. Point out kind of some of those parts. We have our handle, and then we have what's called our bail. The first one had what's called a closed bail. So all of this was enclosed inside of that reel. So there was no real moving parts there. Whereas this, we certainly have those moving parts. To release the line, there's no button on this guy. What we're going to do is we're going to open the bail, and that allows line to come off the reel. Now to stop that, you can do one of 2 things. You can either close the bail and it stops it, or you can just start reeling, and most of them will actually kick over and close the bail as you reel. All right. So either one of those you can use for the bait and spin fishing methods. Again, the closed bail is a little bit less messy if you're just getting started, but if you're wanting to use the spinners, the rooster tails, the panther martins, it's definitely better to go with the spin reel over the bait casting because you're asking for it to do a lot more work. So the closed bail system certainly has its limits. Finally, fly fishing. Um, this is a fly rod, very, very long. I have two pieces here because most of them are about 9 feet long. And then the room I'm in, if it was put together, I'd be smacked in the wall at this point. So for demonstration purposes here, we're just going to take a look at this part right here. Like I said, that leader, when I was talking about fly fishing or referring to the line, that's fly line. So you can see how heavy it is, and it's green. If I were to put a fly on the end of that and try to get, there's very few fish that would eat a fly tied to the end of that. Most fish are smarter than that. So we have that leader, which is what connects our fly line to our fly itself. The reel is pretty easy to use. It's not used that often. We're most often bringing the fish in by hand with the fly reel, but it's important to still kind of understand how they work. The really only thing on this is our drag adjustment that you have to worry about. And that's this little knob here on the back. And all that does is tighten and loosen how much pull or how hard it is or how hard you have to use pull to pull off the reel. So if I tighten my drag down, there's more resistance there and it's harder to pull line off the reel. So harder, looser, you can see. And that's it. So our fly reel is pretty basic. And those are, I would call the 3 basic methods. Once again, we thank everybody for coming. This was definitely a special lesson for me, the fishing one. Look forward to having everybody back and have a great day.